Hello, Daily Bible readers. This is day 23 of our reading of the New Testament and of Genesis. Today we will resume our reading of Genesis in Genesis chapter 17, but first let's begin with our reading in Matthew chapter 26. So here are three things you will want to know about Matthew chapter 26. The first thing you want to know is that Jesus knew. Jesus knew who would betray him. This chapter opens with the chief priest and scribes and elders of the people, along with the high priest Caiaphas, it's a hard one to say tonight, plotting to kill Jesus. Now Judas will play his part in this plot, and we'll see that beginning at about verse 14, where he accepts 13 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. Now later that day, or at least it seems that it was later that same day, they'll be observing the Passover feast with Jesus. And there he will reveal that he knows that one of them is going to betray him. And it seems that all of the apostles ask if it would be them. Even Judas asked if he was the one. And either he did this because he was trying to hide his guilt. He knew he was going to do it and was testing the waters to see if Jesus knew. Or maybe he was just still unsure of himself. He had accepted the silver already, but he hadn't actually gone through with the deed of betraying him. And so not exactly sure why Judas asked, but either way, he asked and Jesus said, "You have said." Now, later that night, as Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas will bring a great multitude. And as he approaches Jesus, he greets him as Rabbi and kisses him on his cheek as a sign to the multitude that this man was the Jesus of Nazareth for whom they were looking. And that's really the last time we read about Judas in this chapter. We'll see him again in the next chapter. So the second thing you'll want to know about this chapter is that Jesus knew that his time was drawing near. And in this chapter, even more so, it seems certain that he knows and he's trying to relay to them the certainty of what's going to happen. In this chapter 26, verse 2, he couldn't be more clear about even the timeline of it, that in 2 days this was all going to take place. He's clear about the end results, that after that he's going to be crucified. Even in the story of being anointed by the woman with the alabaster flask of costly fragrance oil, he saw that she did this as preparation for his burial that was so nearby. And of course, we've already mentioned that Jesus confronted Judas at his betrayal with but then finally, in the garden, the prayer that Jesus prays, he prays, "Oh Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." It seems that he prayed this prayer, or one very similar to it, at least 3 times that night. But in the end, as the mob gathered around him, he goes with them without hesitation, because he knows that the end is near for him now. Now, the third thing you'll want to know from this chapter is that Jesus knows. He knows that fear makes brave men weak at times. We see the Apostle Peter in 4 different lights in this chapter. We see him being very bold when Jesus predicts that they would all deny him. We see Peter being brave when they come to arrest Jesus, and he draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And we see him cave under the pressure of that fear as he is questioned about his association with Jesus of Galilee. But finally, the 4th light in which we see Peter, we see him in humble sorrow, weeping bitterly when he realizes that Jesus had warned him, and yet he still denied him, not once, but 3 times in his darkest hour. Well, since we all cave to fear from time to time, no matter how brave or bold we are at other times, it's Peter's humble sorrow I hope that we focus on most of all from this chapter. These are my thoughts on Matthew chapter 26. So now let's turn our attention to Genesis chapter 17. Here are 3 things you'll want to know about Genesis 17. First, it's been about 13 years since Ishmael was born. Chapter 16 closes with Ishmael's birth, and at that time, Abram is said to be 86 years old. He's now, according to verse 1 of this chapter, 99 years old. And it's at this time that God confirms his covenant with Abram. Once again, this time he'll add some additional signs, I might say signs of faith to the covenant. It would take a great deal of faith for one of these. The first one would have been difficult, but not so terrible. He changes his name from Abram to Abraham. And really, that's more of a sign that he's accepting the future that God is telling him about. But the second one was that every male child in the house of Abraham, including Abraham himself, and Ishmael, who should be 13 years old by this point, were all to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant, which Abraham will do. He'll do this for himself and for Ishmael and for every male among the house of Abraham, according to faith. He does what God requires of him for the covenant to be effective in his life and in the life of his descendants. Now, the second thing that you'll want to know from this chapter is that at this point that God makes it clear that the seed promise given to Abraham would come through Sarah and not through Hagar. I don't know if Abraham was aware of that prior to this chapter. It seems that he's still pleading with God on behalf of Ishmael, that Ishmael, as his son, could continue to fulfill the covenant. But the covenant that God said he would establish will be established not through Ishmael, but through Isaac, whom Sarah, he says, will bear. When? Within the next year. And so God has got very specific about the child, the mother of the child, and even the time frame when all this is going to take place. Now, the third thing you'll want to know is that God's blessing upon Ishmael does not go counter to his blessings for Isaac. Now, you should recall that we said the promise to Abraham was threefold. One was that God would give his descendants the land of Canaan, that they would inherit the land, a land promise. And the second was that he would make of Abraham a great nation, so a nation promise. And then the third promise was the seed promise, that in his seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. Now, it's that seed promise which will not be carried out through Ishmael. But the promise of the great nation that was made to Abraham could be carried out through Ishmael, would be carried out through Ishmael. It will be carried out also through Isaac, but Ishmael, as the son of Abraham, will take part in that as well. And so I hope these thoughts on Genesis chapter 17 and Matthew chapter 26 have been helpful for you. I hope that you're staying caught up on your reading. And my prayer is that as you read,